There's a special kind of loneliness that comes when your own children stop calling. At 60, Rick Delaney knew that emptiness well, and some days the silence in his house felt like it might swallow him whole. Looking for any distraction, he went to a storage auction and won a unit for $100. Inside sat nothing but an old, rusted vault covered in decades of dust and cobwebs. Most people would have walked away disappointed. But when Rick finally managed to crack it open, what he found inside wasn't just valuable, it was connected to his late father, a man he barely knew. The discovery would pull him into a mystery bigger than himself. Could this forgotten vault give him the second chance he'd been searching for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rick Delaney's house sat at the end of Maple Street in Cedar Falls, a quiet Midwest town where everyone knew their neighbors and the pace of life moved with the changing seasons. The two-story colonial had been home for 35 years, filled once with the sounds of children running through hallways and Sarah's laughter drifting from the kitchen. Now it held only silence and memories that grew heavier with each passing day. The morning routine had become a ritual of avoidance. Rick woke at 6, made coffee in a pot sized for 2, and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, scrolling through news he barely absorbed. The chair across from him remained empty, though sometimes he still set out a second mug before remembering. Sarah had been gone 3 years now, taken by cancer that moved faster than any of them had expected. In those final months, the kids had rallied, Emily flying in from Boston every other weekend, Marcus driving down from Chicago whenever he could manage. They'd been a family again, united in grief and love. But after the funeral, after the estate was settled and Sarah's belongings distributed, something had shifted. The phone calls grew shorter. The visits became excuses. Last Thanksgiving, Emily had cited work pressures at her consulting firm. Christmas brought a text from Marcus about his wife Jenna's family obligations. By spring, Rick had stopped expecting them to come home. He'd retired from teaching 2 years earlier, closing the chapter on 3 decades in the classroom at Cedar Falls High School. History had been his subject, and he'd loved it, the way past events could illuminate present choices. His students had called him Mr. D had filled his office with cards when he left, promising to stay in touch. A few had, for a while. But people moved on. That's what they did. The pension was adequate. The house was paid off. Rick had everything he needed, except a reason to use any of it. He'd started taking walks that stretched longer each week, exploring neighborhoods he'd driven past for years without really seeing. He'd joined the library book club, but found himself unable to focus on the discussions. Helen Morrison, his neighbor of 20 years, had noticed his drift. "You're fading, Rick," she'd said one afternoon, standing in his doorway with a casserole she'd made. Helen was 65, a widow herself, with silver hair she wore short and eyes that missed nothing. "I see you walking past my house at odd hours. You've lost weight. When's the last time you called one of your kids?" "They're busy," Rick had replied, taking the dish with genuine gratitude. "Emily's got that big promotion coming up. Marcus and Jenna are trying to buy a house, and you're waiting for them to remember you exist." Helen's tone was gentle but firm. "Call them, Rick. Don't wait for them to figure out you need them." He'd tried, left voicemails that went unreturned, sent texts that got one-word responses hours later. Emily's marriage was struggling, he'd learned through careful questions. Marcus was drowning in his tech job, working 70-hour weeks. They had their own lives, their own problems. Rick understood. He didn't want to be a burden. But understanding didn't make the empty house any quieter. On his bedside table sat a photograph from 1975, one of the few Rick had of his father. Thomas Delaney stood in front of their old house, wearing casual clothes and an expression Rick had spent decades trying to decode. Not quite a smile, not quite stern. Distant, like he was looking past the camera to something only he could see. Rick had been 10 when that photo was taken, still young enough to worship his father without understanding him. Thomas had died when Rick was 19, a heart attack at 52. They'd never been close. Thomas worked long hours at what he'd vaguely described as communications work for the army, traveled frequently, and seemed most comfortable in silence. Rick had learned not to ask questions, sensing somehow that his father preferred the distance between them. After Thomas died, Rick's mother had quietly packed away his belongings, never speaking much about the man she'd married. She'd passed away 15 years ago, taking whatever secrets she'd kept with her. Rick had promised himself he'd be different with his own children. He'd coached their soccer teams, attended every school play, made breakfast on Saturday mornings. He'd been present in all the ways his father hadn't been. And yet here he was, alone in a house too big for one person, wondering where he'd gone wrong. The storage auction had been an accident, if anything in life truly was. Rick had been scrolling through local event listings on a Wednesday afternoon, looking for anything to fill the approaching weekend. A community theatre production, a farmer's market, an estate sale, and then public storage auction, Millbrook facility, Saturday 10 a.m. He'd never been to an auction before, had only seen them on those reality shows Sarah used to watch, where people bid on abandoned units hoping to find treasure among the trash. It seemed like something to do, somewhere to be that wasn't the empty house or another aimless walk through town. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and temperatures mild for September. Rick drove the 30 miles to Millbrook, a neighboring town he'd passed through countless times but never really explored. The storage facility sat on the industrial edge of town, rows of orange metal units behind a chain-link fence. About 20 people had gathered near the office, a mix of regulars with calculating eyes and curious amateurs like himself. The auctioneer was a barrel-chested man named Don, who ran through the rules quickly. Units were sold as is, contents unknown, payment in cash immediately after winning bid. They'd have 48 hours to clear out their purchase, no refunds, no complaints. They moved through 5 units before Don led them to number 347. He cut the lock with bolt cutters and rolled up the door with a metallic screech. Rick peered inside with the others. The unit was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet. And unlike the others, which had been crammed with furniture and boxes, this one looked nearly empty. Lot 347, Don announced. Let's start the bidding at $50. Silence. Rick could see why. There appeared to be nothing inside except what looked like a large metal cabinet or safe against the back wall, covered in rust and cobwebs. No boxes, no furniture, no promise of hidden valuables. $50, Don repeated. Come on, folks. That safe alone is worth something for scrap. Rick raised his hand, more from pity for the auctioneer than any real interest. 50. Don pointed at him. 50 to the gentleman. Do I hear 60? More silence. The other bidders had already moved toward the next unit, writing this one off as worthless. Going once, Don said without enthusiasm. Going twice, sold for $50 to bidder 73. Rick blinked. He'd won. Then Don added, plus $50 buyer's premium. That's 100 total. An hour later, Rick stood alone in front of Unit 347, keys in hand, staring at his purchase. In the morning light, the safe looked even less promising. Rust covered most of its surface. Cobwebs draped across it like abandoned curtains. It stood about 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, bolted to the concrete floor with heavy hardware that had been there so long it seemed part of the foundation. He stepped closer, running his hand over the cold metal. The front featured a dial lock, the kind you'd see in old movies, tarnished but intact. No identifying marks, no manufacturer's label visible under the decay. Rick tried the handle experimentally. Locked solid. Most people would have walked away, cut their losses, maybe called a scrap dealer to haul the thing away. But Rick pulled out his phone and took a photograph. Then another from a different angle. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the teacher in him, always curious about history, about stories locked away in forgotten places. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just something to do. He locked the unit and drove home, the image of that rusted safe occupying his thoughts. That evening, he printed the photos and spread them on his dining room table, studying them like he used to study historical documents with his students. There was something about it, something that whispered of importance beneath the layers of neglect. Helen knocked on his door at 7, carrying another casserole. "Did you go to that auction?" she asked, spotting the photos immediately. "I did," Rick admitted. "Won a unit. There's a safe inside." Helen leaned over the table, examining the images. "Looks old. Military, maybe? See those hinges? That's government-grade hardware." "You think so? My late husband worked in procurement for the county. I've seen enough government surplus to recognize it." She straightened, giving him a thoughtful look. "What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know yet," Rick said. "Try to open it, I suppose." "Be careful," Helen cautioned. "Old safes can be tricky. Might need a professional." After she left, Rick sat alone with the photos, feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Curiosity, purpose, a small flame of interest in what tomorrow might bring. He opened his laptop and searched for information about opening old safes, about vintage locks and forgotten combinations. Hours passed without him noticing. Outside, darkness fell over Cedar Falls, and inside, Rick Delaney found himself planning tomorrow for the first time in a very long while. The next morning, Rick woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his last day in the classroom. He ate breakfast standing at the counter, scrambled eggs and toast consumed quickly while reviewing his research notes from the night before. The consensus online seemed clear. Old safes like the one he'd bought could be opened with patience, the right tools, and a willingness to learn. He gathered supplies from his garage, a stethoscope he'd bought years ago when Marcus was studying medicine before switching to computer science, a notebook, a flashlight, and his toolbox. By 9 o'clock, he was back at the Millbrook storage facility, parking in front of Unit 347 with the determination of a man embarking on an expedition. The September sun warmed his back as he rolled up the metal door. The safe sat waiting exactly as he'd left it, looking no more promising in daylight than it had the day before. Rick dragged a folding chair from his trunk and positioned it in front of the safe, settling in like a student preparing for a long study session. First, he cleaned. Using rags and spray cleaner, he wiped away decades of dust and cobwebs, revealing more of the metal beneath. The rust was superficial in most places, he discovered. Under the decay, the safe appeared structurally sound. The dial turned smoothly when he tested it, which seemed like a good sign. He placed the stethoscope against the metal door and began to turn the dial slowly, listening for the clicks and catches that might indicate the correct numbers. It was painstaking work, requiring focus and patience. Hours slipped past. His back ached from hunching forward, his fingers cramped from the careful manipulation of the dial. But Rick didn't mind. For the first time in months, his mind wasn't circling through painful memories or imagining conversations with children who didn't call. He was present, engaged, working towards something tangible. At noon, he broke for lunch, eating a sandwich in his car while reading more articles on his phone about safe manipulation. The technique was called manipulation, he learned, a method that relied on feeling and hearing the lock's internal mechanisms. Some safes could be opened this way in hours. Others took days or proved impossible without drilling. He returned to his chair, to the dial and the stethoscope, to the slow process of elimination. Late afternoon brought the first real breakthrough, a distinct click at what he thought might be the third number in the combination. He marked it carefully in his notebook, felt a surge of encouragement, and kept working. By 5 o'clock, his enthusiasm had waned. The other numbers refused to reveal themselves. He locked the unit and drove home, frustrated but not defeated. Teaching had taught him that complex problems rarely yielded to a single session of work. Tomorrow he'd try again. That evening, Marcus called. Rick nearly dropped his phone in surprise. "Hey, Dad," Marcus said, his voice carrying the distracted tone of someone multitasking. "Just checking in. How are you doing?" "I'm good," Rick replied, trying not to sound too eager. "Really good, actually. How are you? How's Jenna?" "Busy. Work is insane right now. We're launching a new product next month." Background noise suggested Marcus was calling from the office. "Jenna says hi. Tell her I say hello." Rick hesitated, then decided to share. "I went to a storage auction yesterday, won a unit with an old safe in it. I've been trying to open it." "A safe?" Marcus sounded marginally more interested. "Is there anything in it?" "I don't know yet. Haven't gotten it open. But it's been interesting, trying to figure it out." "Well, good luck with that. Listen, Dad, I've got to jump into a meeting, but I wanted to call. It's been too long." Rick agreed, though the conversation had barely lasted 3 minutes. "Call anytime, Marcus. I'm always here." "Will do. Take care." The line went dead. Rick set the phone down, feeling the familiar mix of gratitude for the call and disappointment at its brevity. But at least Marcus had reached out. That was something. He spent the evening researching more, printing out diagrams of safe mechanisms, making notes about different approaches he might try. When he finally went to bed past midnight, his mind was full of tumblers and lock combinations rather than loneliness. The pattern continued for 3 more days. Rick would arrive at the storage unit each morning, work through the afternoon, return home to research and plan. He grew more skilled at manipulating the dial, more attuned to the subtle sounds and resistances that indicated progress. The safe became less of an obstacle and more of a puzzle he was learning to solve. Helen checked on him each evening, amused by his newfound obsession. "You're looking better," she observed on Wednesday night, less like a ghost haunting his own house. "I feel better," Rick admitted. "It's nice to have a project." "Just a project?" Helen smiled knowingly. "Or are you curious about what's inside?" "Both, I suppose." Rick showed her his notebook filled with numbers and notes. "I think I've got 3 of the combination numbers. Just need the last one." "Your father used to tinker with locks," Helen said suddenly. "Did you know that? I remember seeing him at your kitchen table years ago, taking apart padlocks and putting them back together." "Thomas. That was his name, right?" Rick nodded, a memory surfacing that he'd forgotten for decades. His father at the kitchen table, tools spread out, explaining how a lock worked, while young Rick watched, fascinated. It had been one of the few times Thomas seemed truly present, engaged, willing to share something of himself. "I'd forgotten that," Rick said quietly. "We took apart an old lock together once. He showed me how the pins aligned. Maybe that's why you're so determined with this safe," Helen suggested. "Some part of you remembers." That night, Rick couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about that memory, about his father's patient hands, demonstrating the mechanics of a lock, about the rare warmth in Thomas's voice during that afternoon. What else had he forgotten? What other moments had been buried under the weight of his father's usual distance? Thursday morning arrived with grey clouds, promising rain. Rick almost stayed home, but something pulled him back to Millbrook, back to Unit 347 and the safe that had consumed his week. He worked with renewed focus, the memory of his father guiding his hands as he manipulated the dial. At 2:30 in the afternoon, with rain beginning to patter on the metal roof of the storage facility, Rick heard it. A final, definitive click. His heart pounded as he carefully turned the handle. It moved. The heavy door swung open with a groan of metal that had been sealed for decades. Rick sat back, his hands trembling, and reached for his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness inside the safe, revealing stacks of documents, old photographs, metal boxes, all carefully preserved and waiting. Rick's breath caught as he pulled out the first item, a file folder, manila and aged but intact. Stamped across the front in faded red ink were the words, "Project Sentinel, Classified." Below that, written in a hand he recognized from birthday cards, and the occasional note, Thomas Delaney, vienas tūkstantis devyni šimtai, šešiasdešimt aštuoni vienas tūkstantis devyni šimtai septyniasdešimt tris. His father's name, his father's handwriting, his father's secrets, locked away and forgotten until this moment. Rick sat in the folding chair, folder in his lap, rain falling harder outside. He opened it with careful hands and began to read about a man he thought he'd known, discovering he'd known nothing at all. Rick sat in the dim light of the storage unit, rain drumming steadily on the metal roof above, and stared at the documents spread across the concrete floor. The Project Sentinel folder contained personnel files, technical diagrams, correspondence on official letterhead, and photographs that seemed to document a life his father had never mentioned. He picked up the first item carefully, a military ID badge, encased in plastic, yellowed with age but still legible. The photograph showed a younger Thomas Delaney, perhaps in his mid-30s, with darker hair and a serious expression that made him look like a stranger. The badge identified him as having security clearance for something called Research Station 7, with dates spanning 1968 to 1973. Research Station 7. Rick had never heard his father mention it. Thomas had always described his work vaguely as communications for the army, implying desk work, paperwork, nothing particularly interesting or classified. This badge suggested something entirely different. Rick pulled out more documents, laying them in chronological order as his teacher's mind automatically organized the information. Technical diagrams showed what appeared to be surveillance equipment, microphones, recording devices, monitoring stations. Correspondence between various officials discussed subjects, targets, and domestic monitoring operations. The words made Rick's stomach tighten. Domestic monitoring. During the late 60s and early 70s, he knew enough history to understand what that meant. The government spying on its own citizens during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. A series of photographs caught his attention. They showed his father with other men, all in civilian clothes, standing before nondescript buildings with no identifying marks. In one photo, Thomas stood beside a woman Rick didn't recognize, both holding folders and appearing to be mid-conversation. The woman was perhaps 40, with dark hair pulled back, wearing a professional suit. Someone had written on the back of the photo, TD and Dr. Voss, 1970. Rick set the photo aside and continued through the folder. He found a letter dated September 1972, typed on official stationery, addressed to Thomas from someone identified only as Colonel Morrison. The language was formal, bureaucratic, but certain phrases jumped out. The necessity of compartmentalization for operational security, protecting family members through appropriate distance. Your request for transfer has been noted and will be processed. The father had requested a transfer to get out of whatever Project Sentinel was, and the letter seemed to suggest that keeping distance from family was part of the job, part of the security protocol. Rick's hands shook as he held the letter. All those years, all that distance, the way his father had seemed emotionally absent, even when physically present, had it been intentional? Had Thomas pushed his family away not out of disinterest, but out of some misguided attempt at protection? The rain intensified outside. Rick barely noticed. He pulled out his phone and began photographing everything, the badge, the letters, the diagrams, the photos. He worked methodically, making sure each image was clear and legible, organizing them into folders on his phone. An hour passed. Then two. The light outside began to fade, and Rick realized he'd been sitting on cold concrete for most of the afternoon. His back ached, his knees protested when he stood, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Not yet. He carefully gathered a selection of documents, placed them in a folder he'd brought, and locked the rest back in the safe. The storage unit had become something more than a simple purchase now. It was an archive, a window into a past he'd never known existed. Driving home through the rain, Rick's mind raced. He needed to understand what Project Sentinel had been, what his father had done, why these documents had been hidden away. The classified stamp on the folders made him nervous, but his father had been dead for 40 years. Surely there was no harm in a son learning about his father's past. At home, he spread the documents across his dining room table, the same table where he'd graded papers for decades, where Sarah had paid bills and the kids had done homework. Now it held secrets that transformed everything he'd thought he knew about his family. He opened his laptop and searched for Project Sentinel Cold War Surveillance. Nothing specific appeared. He tried variations: domestic monitoring 1,970 seconds, government surveillance programs, Cold War era. That brought results: articles about COINTELPRO, Operation Chaos, other programs that had targeted anti-war activists, civil rights leaders and journalists. Had Project Sentinel been similar? Had his father been part of spying on American citizens exercising their constitutional rights? Rick sat back, feeling sick. Thomas Delaney had been a quiet man, conservative in his politics but not extreme, someone who'd believed in duty and service. Could he have participated in something illegal? Something that violated the very principles he'd claimed to defend? The doorbell rang, startling Rick from his thoughts. He glanced at the clock, 8:30. Helen stood on his porch, holding an umbrella against the rain. "You didn't answer your phone," she said, concern evident in her voice. "I called 3 times. Are you all right?" Rick realized his phone was still on silent from the storage unit. "I'm sorry. I was distracted. Come in." Helen stepped inside, shaking water from her umbrella. She followed Rick to the dining room and stopped when she saw the documents spread across the table. "Oh my, you got it open. This afternoon." Rick gestured at the papers. "My father was involved in some kind of classified surveillance program. I'm trying to understand what it was." Helen moved closer, examining the documents without touching them. Her expression grew serious as she read, "Rick, these are marked classified. Are you sure you should have them? They're about my father. They were in a storage unit I legally purchased." Even as he said it, Rick heard the defensiveness in his own voice. "That may not matter to the government." Helen looked at him with genuine worry. "If these documents are still classified, possessing them could be illegal. You need to be careful. My father's been dead for 40 years. This is ancient history. History that someone went to great lengths to keep secret." Helen pointed to one of the letters. "This mentions operational security, compartmentalization. These aren't just old records, Rick. These are the kind of secrets governments don't like being exposed." Rick wanted to dismiss her concerns, but he couldn't quite manage it. Helen had a point. The classified stamps, the careful language, the hidden vault. Someone had thought these documents were important enough to lock away. "What do you think I should do?" he asked. "Talk to a lawyer, or at least be very careful about who you tell." Helen touched his shoulder gently. "I know you want to understand your father, but don't put yourself at risk doing it." After she left, Rick sat alone with the documents, weighing his options. He could lock everything back in the safe, walk away, let the past stay buried. That would be the cautious choice, the safe choice. But he thought about his father's face in that old photograph, about the distance that had defined their relationship, about dying without ever really knowing the man who'd raised him. He thought about Emily and Marcus, about the silences growing between them, about patterns repeating across generations. No, he wouldn't walk away. Not yet. Rick found a journal entry tucked between 2 folders, handwritten on lined paper that had yellowed with age. His father's writing was small, precise, dated March 1973. "Today, I burned my bridges. Requested immediate transfer to civilian liaison work. Morrison tried to talk me out of it. Said I was valuable to the operation, but I can't do this anymore. I can't keep watching files on good people who've done nothing wrong except question their government. For Rick's sake, for my family's sake, I must become ordinary. Let them think I'm just another man who couldn't handle the work. Better that than the truth. Rick read it twice, then a third time. His father had chosen to leave, had chosen ordinary life over whatever Project Sentinel offered, and he'd done it for his family. The distance between them suddenly looked different, not abandonment but protection, however misguided. His father had thought that being ordinary, being unmemorable, would keep them safe from whatever he'd been involved in. Rick picked up his phone and called Emily. It went to voicemail. "Hi, sweetheart. It's Dad. I know you're busy, but I wanted to hear your voice. I found something today, something about Grandpa Thomas. When you have time, I'd love to tell you about it. I miss you. Love you." He tried Marcus next with the same result, left a similar message. Then he returned to the documents, determined to piece together the full story of what his father had done and why it had cost them so much. The next morning, Rick returned to the storage unit with a portable work light and better organization supplies. He'd barely slept, his mind spinning with questions about his father and Project Sentinel. Now, in the clear light of day, he was determined to catalogue everything the vault contained. He worked systematically, photographing each document before setting it aside, creating stacks organized by date and type. Personnel files, technical specifications, surveillance reports, and then, in a sealed metal canister toward the back of the safe, he found something that made his breath catch: reel-to-reel audio tapes. 6 of them, each in its own protective case, labeled with dates from 1970 and 1971. One tape was marked Interview 7, Subject 23, in his father's handwriting. Rick held the canister, feeling its weight. These were recordings. Of what? Of whom? The possibilities made him uneasy, but he knew he had to listen. Finding a working reel-to-reel player proved harder than expected. He drove to 3 electronic stores before someone suggested trying antique shops. By early afternoon, Rick stood in a dusty store called Yesterday's Treasures in Cedar Falls, negotiating with the owner over a tape player that looked older than Rick himself. $50, the owner said. And that's a bargain. These things are collector's items now. Rick paid without haggling and carried the machine home like treasure. He set it up on his dining room table, threaded the first tape with hands that trembled slightly, and pressed play. Static filled the room, then cleared. 2 voices emerged, a man and a woman having what sounded like a casual conversation in a diner. They discussed union organizing at a local factory, an upcoming meeting, concerns about management retaliation. The conversation was mundane, unremarkable, the kind of talk that happened in diners across America every day. Then Rick heard a third voice, clinical and detached, speaking over the conversation. Subject 23, identified as Robert Martinez. Meeting with known labor organizer Janet Hoffman. Discussion centers on Article 12, rights and collective bargaining strategies. Assessment. Subjects pose no immediate threat, but warrant continued monitoring. Rick stopped the tape, his stomach turning. These were surveillance recordings. His father and his colleagues had been listening to private conversations, documenting the activities of American citizens whose only crime appeared to be exercising their constitutional rights. He forced himself to continue. The second tape contained another intercepted conversation, this time between activists planning an anti-war demonstration. The third featured journalists discussing a story about government corruption. Each recording was accompanied by the same cold, analytical voiceover, categorizing and assessing people who had done nothing illegal. By the time Rick finished the 4th tape, he felt physically ill. His father had been part of this. Thomas Delaney, who'd taught his son to respect the Constitution, who'd spoken proudly of American freedoms, had participated in systematic surveillance of citizens exercising those very freedoms. But then Rick found something else. Tucked between the tape canisters were handwritten notes, pages of them, in his father's precise script. They appeared to be analysis of the recordings, but the tone was different from the voiceovers. Subject 23, Robert Martinez, one note read. Factory worker, father of 3, trying to improve conditions for his fellow employees. No criminal record, no extremist connections, no justification for surveillance. This is not intelligence work. This is harassment. Another note, dated several months later, listened to 3 more recordings today. Anti-war protesters planning peaceful demonstration. Journalists investigating legitimate government misconduct. Civil rights workers organizing voter registration. These people have done nothing wrong. This is not what I signed up for. This is not protecting America. This is betraying what America is supposed to be. Rick sat back, relief washing through him. His father had questioned it, had seen the moral bankruptcy of what he was doing. The notes documented a growing crisis of conscience that aligned with the journal entry Rick had found the day before. He continued searching through the safe's contents and discovered correspondence between his father and other team members. Several letters expressed similar doubts. One name appeared repeatedly, Dr. Eleanor Voss. She seemed to be the project's lead psychologist, and several letters were exchanges between her and Thomas about the ethical implications of their work. Rick searched for Eleanor Voss online. He found an obituary from 2018. She'd been a professor at Georgetown University for 30 years after leaving government service. The obituary mentioned her work in intelligence ethics and her advocacy for transparency in government operations. A deeper search revealed that Dr. Voss had written a memoir in 2005 titled Conscience and Classification: My Years in Intelligence. The book was out of print, available only through rare book dealers at premium prices. Rick ordered a used copy without hesitation, paying for expedited shipping. While he waited for the book to arrive, he continued cataloging the vault's contents. He created a timeline of his father's involvement in Project Tessitinal, tracking the progression from enthusiastic recruit in 1968 to disillusioned operative requesting transfer in 1973. The documents painted a picture of a man caught between duty and morality, between following orders and following his conscience. Marcus called late that evening. Rick answered on the first ring. "Hey, Dad. Got your message." Marcus sounded tired but engaged. "What's this about, Grandpa?" Rick gave a carefully edited version, the storage unit, the safe, discovering that Thomas had worked on classified government projects during the Cold War. He didn't mention the surveillance tapes or the ethical concerns. Not yet. Not over the phone. "That's pretty cool," Marcus said, and Rick could hear genuine interest in his son's voice. Grandpa always seemed so ordinary. "It's weird to think he had this whole secret life." "That's exactly how I feel," Rick admitted. "Like I'm meeting him for the first time." "Listen, Dad." Marcus paused. "Jenna and I were talking. We haven't been great about staying in touch. That's on us, not you. I'd like to come visit next weekend if you're free. Actually see some of this stuff you found." Rick's throat tightened with emotion. "I'd love that, Marcus. Really love it." "Great. I'll text you when we're on the road." Another pause. "And Dad, I'm glad you found this. You sound different. Better." After they hung up, Rick sat in the quiet house, feeling something he hadn't felt in months: hope. Hope that his son wanted to reconnect. Hope that this mystery might bridge the distance between them. Hope that understanding his father's choices might help him make better choices with his own children. The next day, Eleanor Voss's memoir arrived. Rick spent the afternoon reading it, fascinated by her careful, measured account of working in intelligence during the Cold War. She wrote about the tension between security and liberty, about operations that crossed ethical lines, about operatives who struggled with what they were asked to do. One chapter, titled "Resistors from Within," discussed colleagues who documented abuses and tried to change the system from inside. She never named names, but Rick recognized the descriptions. One passage in particular stood out. A colleague once came to me with evidence of constitutional violations within our program. He'd been archiving everything, every illegal surveillance operation, every targeting of innocent Americans. He wanted to go to Congress to expose what we were doing. I advised caution, knowing the personal cost of whistleblowing, but he was determined. Someone has to stop this, he told me. Someone has to choose what's right over what's easy. I never learned what became of his documentation, but I always admired his courage. Rick stared at the page, conviction growing. His father hadn't just documented abuses, he'd planned to expose them. The vault wasn't just an insurance policy. It was evidence, carefully preserved, meant to prove what Project Sentinel had really been. He found Eleanor Voss's daughter listed in the obituary, Catherine Voss-Chen, a civil rights attorney in Washington, D.C. After an hour of searching, Rick located her email address through her law firm's website. He drafted a message, rewrote it 3 times, finally settled on something simple and direct. Dear Miss Voss-Chen, my name is Rick Delaney. My father, Thomas Delaney, worked with your mother on a classified project in the early 1970 seconds. I recently discovered documents that suggest they knew each other professionally. I'm trying to understand my father's work and thought your mother's perspective might help. If you're willing to speak with me, I would be deeply grateful. Respectfully, Rick Delaney. He attached a photo of the picture showing his father with Dr. Voss and hit send before he could second-guess himself. That evening, Helen stopped by. Rick showed her his father's notes questioning the surveillance, the correspondence with Dr. Voss, the evidence of his growing moral crisis. Your father was a good man in a bad situation, Helen said gently. That's harder than being a bad man or a good man in a good situation. He had to choose. And he chose to leave, Rick said, chose us over the work. He did, Helen smiled. Maybe that's the real story here. Not what he did, but what he refused to keep doing. Rick nodded, feeling the weight of his father's choices settling on his shoulders. Thomas had made sacrifices Rick was only beginning to understand. And now, Rick had to decide what to do with the legacy his father had left behind. Catherine Voss-Chen responded within 24 hours. Her email was professional but warm, expressing surprise and interest in Rick's discovery. She suggested a phone call, and by that evening, Rick found himself talking to a woman who might hold answers he desperately needed. My mother mentioned a Thomas several times over the years, Catherine said, her voice measured and thoughtful. She never gave me details. She took her security clearances seriously, even decades later. But I got the sense he was someone she respected, someone who'd stood up when others hadn't. Rick described the documents he'd found, the surveillance tapes, his father's notes questioning the operations. Catherine listened without interrupting, and Rick could hear her taking notes on the other end of the line. That aligns with what my mother hinted at, she said when he finished. She carried guilt about that program until she died. In her final years, she talked about good men trapped in a bad system, about operators who'd tried to resist from within. Did she keep any records? Rick asked. Anything that might help me understand what Project Sentinel really was? Catherine was quiet for a moment. She donated her papers to Georgetown University's archive. They're under seal until 2030, per her instructions. But, as her next of kin, I have access. Another pause. I'd be willing to share them with you. My mother believed in transparency about government overreach. I think she'd want someone to know the full story. They arranged to meet in Washington, D.C. the following week. Rick hung up feeling energized, more purposeful than he'd felt in years. He told Helen about the conversation, about the planned trip. Be careful, Helen cautioned, but she smiled as she said it. And I'm glad you're doing this. You needed something to believe in again. Saturday arrived, and with it, Marcus and his wife Jenna. Rick watched from the window as they pulled into the driveway, his heart full with an emotion he couldn't quite name. When was the last time his son had visited? 8 months? Longer? The reunion was awkward at first, the kind of stilted conversation that happens when people who love each other have let too much time pass. But Jenna's warmth helped ease the tension. She asked about the house, about the changes Rick had made since Sarah died, about the garden that had once been Sarah's pride. "The roses are struggling," Rick admitted. "I'm not much of a gardener." "We'll help you with them before we leave," Jenna promised. Sarah would want them taken care of. After lunch, Rick took them to the storage unit. Marcus's eyes widened when he saw the vault, now standing open, its contents neatly organized in boxes Rick had brought from home. "This is incredible, Dad," Marcus said, kneeling to examine the documents. "All of this was just sitting here." "For decades, apparently." Rick handed him the Project Sentinel folder. "Your grandfather was part of something big, something controversial." Marcus read through the files with the focused attention he usually reserved for code. Jenna looked over his shoulder, occasionally asking questions that showed she was following along. When Marcus found the coded roster, a list of operatives using code names, he pulled out his phone. "This is fascinating," he said, photographing the pages. "Look at this. They used a substitution cipher for the names. I bet I could decode this with some pattern analysis." Rick felt a surge of pride watching his son work, the way Marcus's analytical mind engaged with the puzzle. They spent the afternoon going through documents together, father and son connected by a mystery that spanned generations. "Why do you think Grandpa kept all this?" Marcus asked as they locked up the unit. "Insurance, maybe," Rick said. "Or evidence. I think he planned to expose what they were doing." That evening, over dinner at Rick's house, they talked about Thomas Marcus's grandfather, a man he'd never known. Rick shared stories he hadn't told in years, about the quiet man his father had been, about the distance that had defined their relationship. "I always thought he just didn't care much," Rick admitted. "Now I'm realizing he kept his distance on purpose. He thought it would protect us." Marcus set down his fork, his expression serious. "Dad, I need to tell you something. Jenna and we're trying to have a baby. We have been for a while now." Rick's breath caught. "Marcus, that's wonderful." "We weren't sure when to tell you," Jenna added, reaching for Marcus's hand. "Things have been so distant between all of us, but being here, seeing this stuff about your father, it made us realize we don't want our kids growing up not knowing their grandfather." "I don't want that either," Rick said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've missed you both so much." The conversation that followed was healing in ways Rick hadn't expected. They talked about the distance that had grown after Sarah's death, about grief and guilt, and the ways families drift apart. Marcus apologized for not calling more. Rick apologized for not reaching out, for assuming his kids didn't want to hear from him. "We always want to hear from you," Marcus said firmly. "We've just been bad at showing it." Sunday morning, before they left, Marcus handed Rick a folder. "I worked on that roster last night. Decoded about 18 of the 23 names." Rick opened it, scanning the list. Many names meant nothing to him, but several jumped off the page. "Gerald Novak, the federal judge?" "Same one," Marcus confirmed. "And Patricia Simmons, she was deputy director of the CIA in the 90s. There's also Raymond Birch. He runs one of the biggest defense contracting firms in the country now." Rick stared at the list, feeling the weight of what it represented. These weren't just historical figures. These were people with current power and influence, people who might not want their involvement in Project Sentinel exposed. "Dad," Marcus said carefully, "if you're thinking about going public with this, you need to be careful. These people have resources, connections. They could make things difficult." "I know." Rick folded the decoded roster carefully. "But your grandfather risked everything to document this. Don't I owe it to him to finish what he started?" Marcus hugged him before leaving, a real embrace that lasted longer than the brief, obligatory hugs of recent years. "Just promise me you'll be smart about it. Talk to a lawyer. Don't do anything rash." After they drove away, Rick stood in the driveway, watching until their car disappeared from view. The house felt less empty than it had in months, filled now with the warmth of family reconnecting. He went inside and pulled out his father's letter, the one written in 1989, a year before Thomas died. Rick had read it so many times he could recite passages from memory, but he needed to read it again to understand what his father would want him to do now. One line stood out, as it always did. "I hope you never find this. But if you do, know that every moment I pushed you away, I was protecting the person I loved most. Forgive me if you can." Rick traced the words with his finger. His father had sacrificed connection to provide protection, had lived with loneliness to keep his family safe. The weight of that sacrifice pressed on Rick's chest, but times were different now. His father had been dead for 40 years. The Cold War had ended. Surely the danger had passed. Surely the truth could finally be told. Rick opened his laptop and began drafting an email to Catherine, confirming their meeting in Washington. He attached several key documents, encrypted them using Marcus's instructions, and sent them with a note. "I think my father was planning to become a whistleblower. I think that's what this vault really is, evidence he preserved to expose Project Sentinel. I need to know if I'm right." He pressed send and sat back, feeling the first stirrings of fear mixed with his determination. Marcus was right. Going public with this information could bring consequences. But staying silent felt like betraying everything his father had stood for. That night, Rick dreamed of his father. In the dream, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, taking apart a lock while young Rick watched. But when Thomas looked up, his expression wasn't distant. He was smiling, and his eyes were full of pride. "You found it," Dream Thomas said. "Now, you have to decide what to do with it. That's the hard part, son. That's always the hard part." Rick woke with sunlight streaming through his bedroom window and Catherine's response waiting in his inbox. "I've reviewed the documents you sent. We need to talk in person. I can meet you this Wednesday in D.C. What you've found is more significant than you realize." Wednesday morning found Rick on a train to Washington, D.C., a briefcase full of documents resting on his lap. He'd chosen train over driving, wanting time to think, to prepare for whatever Catherine might tell him. The landscape rolled past his window fields, giving way to suburbs to the sprawl of the capital. Catherine had suggested meeting at a cafe near Georgetown University, somewhere quiet, where they could talk. Rick arrived early, ordered coffee he didn't drink, and waited with the nervous energy of a student before an important exam. She arrived exactly on time, a poised woman in her mid-50s, with her mother's intelligent eyes and a firm handshake. They settled into a corner booth, and Catherine wasted no time. "Tell me everything," she said, "from the beginning." Rick walked her through the storage auction, opening the safe, his growing understanding of what his father had been involved in. He showed her the documents he'd brought, the personnel files, his father's notes, the correspondence between Thomas and Eleanor Voss. Catherine examined each item carefully, her expression growing more serious as she read. When she reached Thomas's handwritten notes questioning the surveillance operations, she looked up, with something like recognition in her eyes. "My mother talked about him," she said quietly. "She never used his name, but she told me about an operative who'd come to her with concerns about the Untold program, who'd started documenting everything, the constitutional violations, the illegal surveillance, the political targeting." Catherine touched the notes gently. "This is his handwriting?" "Yes. That's my father." "He was brave," Catherine said. "Speaking up in that environment took real courage. The intelligence community doesn't forgive whistleblowers easily." She pulled out her phone and showed Rick photos of documents from her mother's archive. Letters, memos, psychological assessments, all relating to Project Sentinel. One file in particular made Rick's heart race. It was labeled simply Shepherd 7, Thomas Delaney. Shepherd 7 was his code name, Catherine explained. "My mother kept detailed files on all the operatives she evaluated. Your father's file is remarkable." She scrolled through images of typed reports, quarterly assessments, spanning from 1,969 to 1,973. The early evaluations praised Thomas's competence and reliability, but the later reports showed growing concern. Subject displays increasing moral distress regarding target selection. Rick read aloud from one assessment. Questioning mission parameters. Expressing doubt about constitutional basis for surveillance operations. My mother was documenting his crisis of conscience, Catherine said. Look at this. She showed him a handwritten note, never officially filed, dated March 1972. Eleanor Voss's handwriting was neat, precise. Thomas approached me today in confidence. He's been documenting everything: the illegal surveillance, the constitutional violations, the political targeting of law-abiding citizens. He's made copies of everything, stored them somewhere safe. He wants to go to Congress, wants to expose what we're doing. I advised against it, warned him about the personal and professional consequences. But he said, someone has to stop this. Someone has to choose what's right over what's easy. I fear for him. I fear for what they'll do if they discover his plans. But I also admire him more than I can say. Rick's hands shook as he held Catherine's phone. His father had planned to go to Congress, had planned to become a whistleblower, to risk everything to expose the truth. Did he do it? Rick asked. Did he testify? Catherine's expression was thoughtful. My mother believed he did, but anonymously. In 1973, congressional investigators received materials that helped trigger the Church Committee investigations into intelligence abuses. The sources were never publicly identified, but the materials included details only someone inside Project Sentinel would have known. She pulled up newspaper clippings on her tablet, articles from 1973 about Senate investigations into domestic surveillance, about hearings on intelligence overreach. The timeline matched exactly when Thomas had left the program. Your father wasn't just documenting abuses, Catherine said. He was actively working to stop them. That vault you found wasn't an insurance policy, it was his archive, his evidence that he'd tried to do the right thing. Rick sat back, overwhelmed by the revelation. All those years of distance, of emotional absence, his father had been carrying this burden, protecting his family from the consequences of his choices. There's something else you should know, Catherine said, her tone becoming more cautious. Some of the people on that roster your son decoded, they have serious power now. If this information becomes public, they'll push back hard. Marcus warned me about the same thing. Your son is right to be worried. Catherine leaned forward. But I think you should consider releasing this information. The public deserves to know what was done in their name. My mother believed that. It's why she donated her papers to Georgetown, why she wrote her memoir. Transparency about past abuses helps prevent future ones. But how do we release it safely? Rick asked. I don't want to put my family at risk. We work with journalists who specialize in historical accountability. We go through proper legal channels to declassify what we can. We build a coalition: historians, civil liberties attorneys, former intelligence officials who support transparency. Catherine pulled out a business card. This is a colleague of mine, Diana Flores. She's an attorney who specializes in these kinds of cases. She can help protect you legally while we work toward declassification. Rick took the card, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. He thought about his father, about the courage it took to stand up to the entire intelligence apparatus, about the sacrifice Thomas had made, pushing away the people he loved to keep them safe. But times had changed. His father had been dead for 40 years. The Cold War had ended. Surely the statute of limitations, moral if not legal, had run out on punishing people for exposing wrongdoing. I need to think about it, Rick said. Talk to my kids. Make sure they're okay with the risk. Of course. Catherine smiled. But Rick, your father would be proud of you. Just finding this, trying to understand it, willing to consider doing the right thing that takes the same courage he had. They spent another hour going through documents, comparing notes from Thomas and Eleanor, piecing together the full scope of Project Sentinel. It had been larger than Rick imagined, with tentacles reaching into newsrooms, universities, activist organizations across the country. Thousands of Americans had been surveilled without warrants, their private conversations recorded, their lives disrupted, all in the name of national security. On the train home, Rick stared out the window and thought about legacy. His father had left him more than documents. He'd left him a choice, the same choice Thomas had faced in 1972. Stay silent and safe, or speak up and risk the consequences. Rick pulled out his phone and called Emily. She answered after 3 rings, sounding surprised. "Dad? Is everything okay?" "I'm on a train back from Washington," Rick said. "I met with someone who knew Grandpa Thomas, who helped me understand what he was involved in." "And?" Emily's voice carried genuine curiosity. "He was a hero, Em, a real one. He stood up to powerful people when it would have been easier to stay silent." Rick paused, emotion tightening his throat. "I'm thinking about following his example, but I wanted to tell you first. Make sure you're okay with it." There was a long silence. Then Emily said, "Dad, I'm coming home. My marriage is over. We're filing for divorce. I need some time to figure out what's next, and I want to do that in Cedar Falls, with you." "Your room is ready," Rick said immediately. "It's always ready." "I'll be there next week." Emily's voice softened. "And Dad, whatever you decide about Grandpa's stuff, I support you." It sounds like he was brave. Maybe it runs in the family. After they hung up, Rick sat with his phone in his hand, watching Maryland countryside blur past. His daughter was coming home. His son was reconnecting. His father's story was finally being understood. Everything was changing, all because of a $100 storage unit and the courage to open what had been locked away. He texted Marcus, "Met with Catherine Voschen. Your grandfather was a whistleblower. He tried to expose Project Sentinel. I'm thinking about finishing what he started. We need to talk." Marcus's response came quickly. "Come to Chicago this weekend. Let's figure this out together. Jenna wants to help too. We're family, Dad. We do this as a family." Rick smiled, tears blurring his vision. "Yes, family. That's what this had always been about, understanding the family that came before, rebuilding the family that remained, protecting the family that might come after." When he arrived home that evening, Helen was waiting on his porch. "Well?" she asked. "How did it go?" "My father was a hero," Rick said simply, "and I think I know what I need to do." Helen studied his face, then nodded. "Then do it. But do it smart. And know that I'm here if you need anything." Rick spent that night organizing documents, making copies, storing everything in multiple secure locations, just as Marcus had taught him. He was preparing for something big, something that would honor his father's memory and maybe, finally, give Thomas Delaney the recognition he deserved. The weekend trip to Chicago gave Rick time to think. Marcus met him at the train station, and they drove through the city to the apartment Marcus and Jenna shared in a neighborhood filled with young professionals and coffee shops. It felt worlds away from Cedar Falls, but Marcus seemed happy here, rooted in a life he'd built. Over dinner, the 3 of them spread documents across the dining table, the same ritual Rick had performed alone in his own house, now shared with family. Marcus had done more work on the coded roster, cross-referencing names with public records, building profiles of where these former operatives had ended up. "This is bigger than we thought, Dad," Marcus said, pointing to his laptop screen. "Look at this, 5 of them held positions in the intelligence community after Project Sentinel ended. 3 went into private security. 2 became federal judges. And Raymond Birch, who was Cardinal 1, now runs Birch Security Systems. They have contracts worth billions with the Department of Defense." "They all stayed connected to government work," Jenna observed. studying the timeline Marcus had created, like they were protecting something, or being protected, Rick said quietly. If Project Sentinel was as illegal as it seems, everyone involved had motivation to keep it buried. They talked late into the night, weighing options. Marcus wanted his father to consult with Diana Flores before doing anything public. Jenna suggested they reach out to historians first, build an academic foundation for the revelations. Rick listened to their concerns, grateful for their engagement, their willingness to help carry this burden. Sunday morning, Emily called. She'd arrived in Cedar Falls the night before, let herself into the house with her old key. "I'm home, Dad," she said, and Rick could hear tears in her voice. "The house feels so quiet without you here." "I'll be back tomorrow," Rick promised. "Stay as long as you need, sweetheart. Forever, if you want." On the train home Monday afternoon, Rick reviewed everything he'd learned. His father had been part of an illegal surveillance program, had documented its abuses, had likely testified to Congress anonymously, and had spent the rest of his life living with the consequences of those choices. The vault had been Thomas's insurance, his proof that he'd tried to do the right thing. But something nagged at Rick, a question he couldn't quite articulate. If his father had already testified, if he'd already provided evidence to congressional investigators, why keep the vault sealed? Why not destroy the documents once the church committee had done its work? Why preserve everything for decades after the threat had supposedly passed? The answer came to him as Maryland countryside gave way to Pennsylvania. His father hadn't been finished. The testimony had been anonymous, the evidence provided through intermediaries. Thomas had preserved the vault in case he ever needed to prove he'd been the source, in case someone ever needed to verify the truth of what had been revealed, or in case the first attempt hadn't been enough. Rick arrived home to find Emily in the kitchen, cooking dinner. The house smelled like garlic and herbs, like it used to when Sarah was alive. His daughter looked thinner than he remembered, shadows under her eyes, but she smiled when she saw him. "Hey, Dad," she said, and hugged him tightly. "I made your favorite chicken piccata." They ate together, talking about her marriage ending, about the consulting job she'd hated for years, about wanting to find work that mattered. Emily had always been driven, ambitious in ways that reminded Rick of Sarah. But somewhere along the way, she'd lost herself in chasing what she thought she should want. "I'm thinking about going back to school," she said. "Maybe becoming a therapist. Helping families work through their issues." She laughed, but it was tinged with sadness. "God knows I've got experience with family dysfunction." "We haven't been dysfunctional," Rick said gently. "We've been grieving. There's a difference." After dinner, he showed her everything, the vault documents, the surveillance tapes, the correspondence between Thomas and Eleanor Voss. Emily read through it all with her analyst's mind, asking sharp questions, making connections Rick hadn't considered. "Grandpa was trying to protect you," she said finally. "But he was also trying to protect himself. If they'd known he was the source, they could have destroyed him. Charged him with espionage, ruined him financially and legally. He chose us," Rick said. "Chose safety over vindication. But he kept the evidence," Emily pointed out. "He wanted the option to go public if he needed to. This isn't just a record, Dad. This is a loaded gun he never fired." The metaphor unsettled Rick, but he recognized its accuracy. The vault was leverage, power, protection, all waiting for the right moment or the right person to use it. Tuesday morning brought an email from Catherine with an attachment that changed everything. The subject line read simply, "You need to see this." Rick opened the attachment, a scanned document from Eleanor Voss's archive, dated June 1973. It was a transcript, faded but legible, marked "Closed Testimony, Senate Select Committee, Witness, Anonymous." Rick's hands shook as he read. The testimony was detailed, damning, comprehensive. It described Project Sentinel's scope, its methods, its targets. It named the officials who'd authorized the program, the legal justifications they'd twisted to make it seem legitimate, the constitutional violations they'd committed in the name of national security. And throughout the document, Rick recognized his father's voice. The careful phrasing, the teacher's instinct to explain complex ideas clearly, the moral clarity that had marked Thomas's private notes. Catherine's email continued. My mother kept this separate from the main archive. She told me once that it was the most important document in her possession, proof that someone had tried to stop Project Sentinel from the inside. She never told me who the witness was, but after seeing your father's documents, I'm certain. This is Thomas Delaney's testimony. He did it, Rick. He stood up and told the truth. Rick sat at his dining table, reading the testimony 3 times, tears streaming down his face. His father had done it, had risked everything to expose the truth. The distance between them, the emotional absence it had all been to protect Rick from the consequences of Thomas's courage. Emily came, downstairs, saw her father crying, and sat beside him. Dad, what is it? He showed her the testimony. She read it silently, then looked up with wonder in her eyes. He was a hero. He was, Rick whispered, and I never knew. That afternoon, Rick received another email, this one from an address he didn't recognize. No subject line. The message was brief and chilling. Mr. Delaney, we understand you've recently acquired certain materials related to Project Sentinel, a defunct classified program. We appreciate your discretion regarding these materials. However, we feel it's important to discuss the legal implications of possessing documents that may remain subject to classification restrictions. We'd like to arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience to resolve this matter amicably. Please respond within 48 hours. Office of the Inspector General, Department of Defense. Rick stared at the email, his heart pounding. How did they know? The storage facility. Had someone reported the classified markings? Or had he been less careful than he thought, leaving digital traces that had triggered alerts? He forwarded the email to Catherine and Marcus immediately, then called Diana Flores, the attorney Catherine had recommended. Her assistant said she'd call back within the hour. Emily read the email over his shoulder. Dad, this sounds like a threat. I think it is, Rick said quietly. A polite one, but a threat nonetheless. He looked out the window at Maple Street, at the familiar houses and trees, at the ordinary neighborhood where he'd lived for 35 years. Somewhere out there, people were watching. People who didn't want Project Sentinel's secrets exposed. People with power and resources who could make his life very difficult. But Rick thought about his father, standing alone before congressional investigators, telling the truth despite the risks. Thomas had been brave when bravery cost him everything. Could Rick do any less? Diana Flores called back within 30 minutes. Her voice was calm, professional, reassuring. Mr. Delaney, don't respond to that email yet. Don't communicate with them at all until we've talked strategy. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? I'll be there, Rick said. That evening, Helen came by and found Rick and Emily sitting in tense silence at the kitchen table, the threatening email displayed on Rick's laptop. They know, Helen said simply, reading over Rick's shoulder. How? We're not sure, Emily answered. Maybe the storage facility reported the classified markings. Maybe Dad left a digital trail they traced. Or maybe someone's been watching all along, Rick said quietly. Catherine said some of these former operatives have serious resources. If they've been monitoring for any mentions of Project Sentinel, my searches online could have triggered alerts. Helen sat down heavily. What are you going to do? Meet with a lawyer tomorrow. Figure out our legal position. Rick looked at his daughter. Em, I'm sorry I've pulled you into this. Don't be. Emily's voice was firm. This is family. This is history. This matters. I'm not going anywhere. That night, Rick barely slept. He kept thinking about his father, about the courage it took to testify against powerful people, to risk everything for truth. Thomas had lived the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, keeping his family at arm's length to protect them. Was Rick ready for that kind of sacrifice? Diana Flores's office occupied the top floor of a modern building in downtown Chicago. Rick had driven up early, leaving Emily to hold down the fort in Cedar Falls. Diana herself was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, with black hair pulled back in a practical bun and an air of competence that immediately put Rick at ease. "Tell me everything," she said, and Rick did. He walked her through the storage auction, the vault, the documents, the surveillance tapes, his father's testimony. He showed her the email from the Department of Defense, Catherine's correspondence, Marcus's decoded roster. Diana listened without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad. When he finished, she sat back and studied him. "Mr. Delaney, you've stumbled into something significant. These documents could rewrite the historical record of Cold War intelligence operations. They could embarrass powerful people and expose government overreach that's never been fully acknowledged." "I know," Rick said. "That's why I want to release them. And that's why the government wants to stop you." Diana tapped her pen against the legal pad. "But here's the thing. You have a strong legal position. You purchased that storage unit legally. The documents were abandoned property. Your father is deceased, so there's no question of you stealing classified materials from a current operative. So I can release them?" "Legally? Probably yes, though the government will fight it. They'll argue national security, claim the documents are still classified, threaten prosecution." Diana leaned forward. "But Mr. Delaney, I've handled cases like this before. The government's threats are often louder than their actual legal standing. They rely on intimidation because their legal arguments are weak. What do you recommend? We go on offense, file a formal request for declassification of Project Sentinel materials. Argue that documents this old, about programs long defunct, serve no national security purpose being classified. We build a coalition, historians, journalists, civil liberties organizations who support transparency. And we prepare to go to court if necessary." Rick felt something settle in his chest, determination mixed with fear, but determination stronger. "Let's do it." Diana smiled. "Good. Because I think your father would want you to finish what he started. Now, about that email from the Department of Defense. We're going to respond, but on our terms." They spent the next 2 hours crafting a response, Diana's legal expertise shaping every word. The message was polite but firm. Rick acknowledged possessing the documents, asserted his legal right to them, and requested a meeting to discuss declassification rather than confiscation. "This puts them on notice," Diana explained. "We're not hiding, not destroying evidence, not running scared. We're engaging as equals with legitimate legal standing." Before Rick left, Diana gave him specific instructions. "Document everything. Keep multiple copies in multiple secure locations. Never keep all the originals in one place. And Mr. Delaney, expect them to respond quickly. They won't like being challenged." The drive back to Cedar Falls gave Rick time to process everything. He was really doing this, taking on the Department of Defense, challenging powerful people, exposing secrets that had been buried for decades. Part of him still couldn't believe it. But another part, the part that had spent weeks learning about his father's courage, felt ready. Emily was waiting when he arrived home. "Well, we're going forward," Rick said. "Diana is filing for declassification. We're building a legal case." Emily hugged him tightly. "I'm proud of you, Dad." That evening, Marcus called with news. "Dad, I've been digging deeper into those names from the roster. Raymond Birch, the guy who runs Birch Security Systems. His company has been in the news lately. There's an ongoing investigation into their billing practices, allegations they've been overcharging the government for years. Why does that matter? Because exposure of his involvement in Project Sentinel could tank his government contracts. He's got billions of dollars in reasons to keep this quiet." Marcus paused. "And Dad, there's something else." I found a connection between 3 of the former operatives. They all sit on the board of a private security think tank that advises Congress on intelligence matters. Rick felt a chill. They're still connected, still influencing policy. Exactly. These aren't just old men trying to protect their reputations. They're people with current power who might see this exposure as a threat to their ongoing influence. After they hung up, Rick sat in his study, thinking about what Marcus had revealed. This wasn't just about historical truth. It was about current power structures, about people who'd built careers on the foundation of Project Sentinel and didn't want that foundation examined too closely. The next morning, Helen knocked on his door early. She looked worried. "Rick, there's a car parked across the street. It's been there since dawn. 2 men in suits. They're just sitting there, watching your house." Rick went to the window and looked. Sure enough, a dark sedan sat at the curb, 2 figures visible in the front seats. As he watched, one of them raised a phone, clearly taking pictures. "They're sending a message," Emily said, coming to stand beside him. "They want you to know they're watching." "It's working," Rick admitted. "I'm scared." "Being scared is smart," Emily said. "But Dad, think about Grandpa Thomas. He was scared too, but he did it anyway. That's what courage is." Rick thought about his father, testifying before Congress while knowing his career could end, his freedom could be taken, his family could be hurt. Thomas had been scared too, but he'd done the right thing anyway. "I need to call Diana," Rick said, "and Catherine. We need to accelerate our timeline. If they're already watching, they might be planning to take more aggressive action." The phone rang before he could pick it up. Diana's number flashed on the screen. "Mr. Delaney," she said, without preamble, "the Department of Defense has filed a motion to seize your documents. They're claiming national security concerns. We have a hearing scheduled for next week. We need to prepare, and we need to do it fast." The federal courthouse in Chicago was an imposing building of stone and glass, the kind of architecture designed to remind citizens of the weight of law. Rick stood on the steps Tuesday morning, Diana beside him, Marcus and Emily flanking them both. Helen had driven up as well, refusing to let Rick face this alone. Catherine stood with them, having flown in from Washington the night before. "Ready?" Diana asked. Rick nodded, though his hands trembled slightly. "Let's do this." The courtroom was smaller than he'd expected, wood-paneled and formal, with Judge Patricia Morrison presiding from an elevated bench. She was in her 60s, silver-haired, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Rick recognized the name from his research. Morrison had a reputation for fairness, but also for taking national security concerns seriously. The government's attorney was a man named Gerald Strauss, mid-40s, with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case involving classified materials. He presented the government's argument with practiced ease. "Your Honor, the documents in Mr. Delaney's possession are marked, classified, and remain subject to those restrictions, regardless of how they were acquired. Releasing them poses risks to national security, compromises intelligence methods that may still be in use, and violates federal statutes regarding classified information. We request the court order immediate surrender of all materials to the Department of Defense." Diana stood, and Rick felt a surge of confidence in her presence. "Your Honor, my client legally purchased abandoned property. The previous owner is deceased and has been for 40 years. These documents describe programs that ended in 1973, over 50 years ago. The government has provided no evidence that releasing historical information about defunct programs poses any current security risk. This is about transparency and historical accountability, not national security." Judge Morrison listened without expression. "Mr. Strauss, can you specify what current national security interests are threatened by these documents?" Strauss shifted. "The documents describe intelligence methods and relationships that 50-year-old methods—" Diana interrupted. "Your Honor, the Church Committee exposed similar programs decades ago. The intelligence community has long since adapted. These documents are historical artifacts, nothing more." They contain names, Strauss countered. Operatives whose identities remain classified. Operatives who are now in their 70s and 80s, many deceased, none currently operational. Diana pulled out a document. We've prepared an analysis showing that every name in these files either is already public through other declassified materials or belongs to someone no longer involved in intelligence work. Judge Morrison held up I'd like to hear from Mr. Delaney himself. Sir, why is releasing these documents important to you? Rick stood, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected to speak, but Diana nodded encouragingly. Your Honor, my father was Thomas Delaney. He was part of Project Sentinel, and he became a whistleblower when he realized the program was violating the constitutional rights of American citizens. He testified before Congress in 1973, anonymously, helping to trigger the Church Committee investigations. But he paid a price for that courage. He spent the rest of his life keeping his family at a distance, believing we'd be safer if we didn't know what he'd done. Rick's voice grew stronger as he continued. I grew up thinking my father was cold, distant, uninterested in his family. It wasn't until I found these documents that I understood he loved us enough to push us away. He protected us by staying silent about his own heroism. Now he's been dead for 40 years, and I think it's time his story was told. Not to embarrass anyone or compromise security, but to honor a man who chose what was right over what was easy. The American people deserve to know that there were operatives like my father who resisted from within, who documented abuses, who tried to stop programs that betrayed our values. The courtroom was silent when Rick finished. Judge Morrison studied him for a long moment. Mr. Strauss, I'm inclined to agree with Miss Flores that these materials are primarily historical. However, I'm troubled by the classified markings. I'm going to order both parties to work with the relevant agencies to determine what portions of these documents can be declassified and what portions, if any, genuinely require continued protection. Your Honor, Strauss began, but Morrison raised her hand. This is not a victory for either side. Mr. Delaney, you will not release these documents publicly until the declassification review is complete. Mr. Strauss, your office will expedite that review and provide clear justification for any continued classification. I want this resolved within 90 days. In the meantime, Mr. Delaney retains possession of the materials under seal of the court. They will not be surrendered to the government, but neither will they be released to the public. She banged her gavel. We're adjourned. Outside the courthouse, Rick felt the weight of 90 days settling on his shoulders. Not a win, not a loss, but a continuation. This is actually good, Diana explained as they walked toward their cars. The judge didn't order you to surrender the documents. That's huge. And by requiring the government to justify continued classification, she's put the burden on them. Catherine hugged Rick. Your father would be proud. You stood up in federal court and told his story. That took courage. Marcus and Emily bracketed their father, providing silent support. Helen just squeezed his hand, understanding without words. As they left the courthouse steps, Rick noticed Agent Carlson standing near a car across the street. The agent nodded, not threatening, not friendly, just acknowledgement. Rick nodded back. The fight wasn't over. But Rick had taken the first real stand, had spoken truth in a place where truth mattered. Whatever happened next, he'd honored his father's memory. And somehow, that felt like enough. The Washington Post article ran the following Sunday, and everything changed. Sarah Chen's piece was comprehensive, balanced, and devastating. She'd woven Rick's personal story with the larger historical context of Project Sentinel, using the documents he'd provided to expose a surveillance program that had targeted thousands of innocent Americans. The article included portions of Thomas Delaney's anonymous testimony, now attributed to him for the first time, and quoted from his handwritten notes expressing moral anguish about the work. The whistleblower who stayed silent, how Thomas Delaney exposed government overreach, then disappeared into obscurity, ran as the cover story. Within hours, it was trending on social media. By Monday morning, other news outlets were picking up the story. Rick's phone wouldn't stop ringing. He sat in his living room, Emily beside him, watching the coverage spread. CNN ran a segment on Cold War surveillance programs. NPR interviewed civil liberties experts who praised Thomas Delaney's courage. The New York Times published an editorial calling for full declassification of Project Sentinel records. "Dad, you did it," Emily said, her eyes shining. "The world knows about Grandpa now. They know what he did." But the attention wasn't universally positive. Conservative news outlets questioned whether Rick had committed crimes by possessing classified materials. Opinion pieces argued that some secrets were necessary, that exposing old intelligence programs endangered current operations. Raymond Birch, the defense contractor whose name appeared on the decoded roster, issued a statement through his lawyers, denying any wrongdoing and threatening legal action against irresponsible revelations. Diana called, midday, Monday. "Rick, I've been contacted by 3 different congressional offices. They want to hold hearings about Project Sentinel. They're talking about forming a commission to review what other Cold War programs might still be improperly classified." "Is that good?" "That's excellent. Congressional interest puts pressure on the executive branch. It makes it much harder for them to keep fighting declassification." Diana's voice carried barely contained excitement. "You've created momentum, Rick. Real momentum for transparency." Catherine called next with news that Georgetown was planning an exhibition about intelligence whistleblowers, featuring Thomas Delaney's story prominently. "My mother's dream was that the truth about these programs would come out. You've made that happen." Marcus drove down from Chicago that evening with Jenna. They brought takeout and gathered around Rick's dining table, the same table where Rick had first spread out his father's documents weeks ago, feeling lost and purposeless. Now that table held newspapers with his father's story, printed proof that Thomas Delaney's courage hadn't been forgotten. "I have news," Marcus said, glancing at Jenna with a smile Rick recognized. "Jenna's pregnant. We found out last week, but we wanted to tell you in person." Rick stood so quickly his chair scraped back. "Marcus. Oh my God. I'm going to be a grandfather." They embraced, and Rick felt tears streaming down his face, joy mixed with grief that Sarah wasn't here to share this moment, gratitude that he'd get to meet his grandchild, overwhelming relief that he'd reconnected with his children in time to be part of their lives. "We want to name him Thomas," Jenna said. "If it's a boy." After his great-grandfather, Rick couldn't speak. He just nodded, holding his son, thinking about generations and legacy and the way courage could echo through time. Emily hugged her brother, then turned to Rick. "I've been thinking. I'm going to stay in Cedar Falls, go to graduate school somewhere nearby. I want to be close to you, Dad. I want to be here when the baby comes. I want us to be a family again." "We are a family," Rick said. "We always were. We just forgot for a while." That evening, after Marcus and Jenna had driven back to Chicago, after Emily had gone to bed, Rick sat alone in his study. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a fresh piece of paper. He'd been thinking about this for days, and now seemed like the right time. He began to write, "My dear grandson, by the time you read this, you'll be old enough to understand who Thomas Delaney was, the man you're named after. Your great-grandfather was a hero, though he never used that word himself. He saw injustice and spoke up, even when silence would have been easier and safer. He paid a price for that courage, living with distance from the people he loved, carrying secrets that weighed on him until he died. But he never regretted doing what was right. I hope I've learned that lesson well enough to pass it on to you. Your great-grandfather taught me that doing the right thing is never easy, but it's always worth it. Be brave, be kind, and when you see something wrong, don't be silent. The world needs people like Thomas Delaney, people like I hope you'll become. With all my love, Your grandfather, Rick. He sealed the letter, wrote, for Thomas on the envelope, and placed it in his desk. Someday, years from now, his grandson would read it and know the story of the man whose name he carried. Rick walked through his house, seeing it differently now. Not empty, but full of memories, full of possibility, full of family healing and reconnecting. The silence that had suffocated him months ago had been replaced by something richer. Peace. Tomorrow, he'd continue working with Diana on the declassification process. He'd coordinate with Catherine on the Georgetown exhibition. He'd answer journalists' questions and maybe testify before Congress if they asked. The work of honoring his father's legacy would continue. But tonight, Rick Delaney stood in the home where he'd raised his children, knowing they were coming back to him, knowing a grandchild was on the way, knowing his father's story would live beyond the vault that had hidden it for so long. He'd found what he'd been searching for in that storage unit. Not treasure, not wealth, but something infinitely more valuable: understanding, purpose, connection, and the courage to do what his father would have wanted. The vault was empty now, its secrets released, but Rick felt fuller than he had in years. 6 months later, early spring arrived in Cedar Falls with warmth that felt like promise. Rick stood in his backyard, hands dirty from planting, restoring Sarah's garden with Emily's help. The roses were thriving again, pink and white blooms opening to the sun. Emily had taken on the project with determination, researching varieties and soil conditions, bringing life back to ground that had gone fallow. "Mum would love this," Emily said, stepping back to admire their work. "She would," Rick agreed, feeling Sarah's presence in the garden she'd loved, in the daughter who'd inherited her green thumb and her strength. Inside the house, preparations were underway. Marcus and Jenna were arriving that afternoon with 3-week-old Thomas James Delaney, making their first trip to Cedar Falls since the baby's birth. Helen had been cooking for days, filling Rick's freezer with casseroles and baked goods. Catherine was flying in from Washington. Even Diana was coming, having become more friend than attorney over the months of working together. The declassification process had concluded 2 weeks earlier. Judge Morrison had ruled that 90% of Project Sentinel documents could be released to the public, with only minor redactions for genuinely sensitive information. The Department of Defense had chosen not to appeal. Thomas Delaney's full testimony, his notes, his correspondence, all of it would be archived at the National Archives, available to historians and citizens alike. The Georgetown exhibition had opened in February, featuring Thomas's story as a central narrative. Rick had attended the opening, stood before display cases containing his father's documents, and watched visitors read about the man who'd risked everything to expose government overreach. A photograph of Thomas, the one from 1975, his distant expression now understood as protective love, anchored the exhibit. Congressional hearings had led to new transparency guidelines for declassifying Cold War-era intelligence materials. Several other whistleblowers from that era had come forward, encouraged by Thomas's story, sharing their own accounts of resisting from within. The public understanding of that period was being rewritten, nuanced by the voices of people who'd tried to do right in difficult circumstances. Raymond Birch had quietly resigned from his defense company's board, citing health reasons. 2 other former Project Sentinel operatives had issued public apologies for their roles in the surveillance program. The past was being acknowledged, if not fully reconciled. But for Rick, the real transformation was simpler and more personal. His house was full again, Emily living upstairs in her old room, pursuing her graduate degree in counseling, home for family dinners and quiet conversations. Marcus calling several times a week, sending photos of baby Thomas, planning regular visits. The silence that had nearly destroyed Rick had been replaced by connection, by family healing across generations. The doorbell rang, and Rick hurried to answer. Marcus stood on the porch, Jenna beside him, holding a bundle wrapped in soft blue blankets. Rick's grandson, named for a hero, carried into the house where that hero's story had been hidden and then revealed. "Hey, Dad," Marcus said. "Say hello to Thomas." Rick took his grandson carefully, cradling the tiny life in his arms. The baby's eyes were closed, his face peaceful, unaware of the legacy he carried. Rick felt his throat tighten with emotion. 3 generations connected through courage and love, through secrets revealed and wounds healed. "Welcome home, little one," Rick whispered. "You're named for someone extraordinary. I'll make sure you know his story." The afternoon passed in warmth and laughter. Helen fussed over the baby, decades of neighborhood friendship making her unofficial grandmother. Catherine shared news of additional archives being opened, other stories waiting to be told. Diana updated them on her newest case, another whistleblower she was representing, inspired by Thomas Delaney's example. As evening approached, Rick found himself on the porch with Marcus, watching the sun set over Maple Street. His son held baby Thomas, rocking gently, and Rick remembered holding Marcus this same way 40 years ago, full of hopes and fears about the kind of father he'd be. "You did something important, Dad," Marcus said. "Not just exposing Project Sentinel. You brought our family back together. You showed us what matters." "I found a storage unit," Rick said with a smile. "Everything else just followed. You found more than a storage unit. You found Grandpa. You found purpose. You found us again." Marcus shifted the baby, glanced at his father. "And you gave my son a name worth living up to." Inside, Emily called that dinner was ready. They went in together, 3 generations gathering around the table, 4, counting baby Thomas sleeping in his carrier. Helen said grace. Catherine proposed a toast to Thomas Delaney, and they ate together with the ease of family that had found its way back to itself. Later, after everyone had left or gone to bed, Rick stood in his study looking at the photograph of his father. Thomas's distant expression no longer seemed cold. It seemed protective, loving, sacrificial. A father doing everything he could to keep his child safe. "I understand now," Rick said softly to the photograph, "and I hope you understand what I did. I hope you'd be proud." He could almost hear his father's response, could almost feel Thomas's approval. The vault had been opened, the secrets revealed, the truth told. And in the telling, a family had been healed, a hero honored, and a lonely man had found his way home. Rick turned off the light and walked upstairs, past Emily's room where soft music played, past the guest room where Marcus and Jenna slept with their son. His house was full. His heart was full. The storage unit that had seemed like just a distraction, just something to fill empty hours, had given him everything he'd been missing. Sometimes the past waits until we're finally ready to face it. And sometimes, when we're brave enough to open what's been locked away, we find the very thing we've been searching for all along. Rick climbed into bed, listening to the sounds of family in his house, and slept peacefully for the first time in years.